Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the economy in China, and specifically to talk about the $9 trillion debt nightmare that local governments have built up. Now, up until 1994, local governments in China weren't allowed to borrow any money. Everything was handled centrally by the Chinese authorities. However, in 1994, China decided that it wanted to increase its earnings, and it decided to empower local governments. And as part of the reforms that were brought in, those local governments were able to borrow money through special purpose vehicles called local government financing vehicles. And over the last 30 years, those vehicles have built up over $9 trillion worth of debt. $9 trillion is more than half of China's GDP in 2023. So we are talking a huge amount of money. $9 trillion is actually more than the GDP of every country in the world apart from the USA and China. So this is a serious chunk of change. And what's happened over the last 30 years is the local governments have grown dependent on the growth of the property market. They couldn't see any end in sight in terms of the increase in property values and the increase in property sales. But as I'm sure you'll know if you've been following the channel, over the last 2 years, the wheels have come off the property market in China. It's been a complete train wreck in terms of what's happened. And obviously these local governments weren't expecting this to happen, and they're now in a world of pain in terms of both servicing the debt that they built up and also refinancing it. And we've got a lot of maturities that are happening in 2024. So in today's video, we'll talk about what's gone on with regards to the growth of that debt, the establishment of the local government financing vehicles. We'll have a look at what's been happening with the value of land sales over the last few years, what's going on with regards to the debt maturity and debt servicing for the local government financing vehicles, what pressure they're under, and then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think is likely to happen over the next 12 to 18 months and whether or not China is going to need to bail out all of these local authorities, and if they do, who's going to bail out China? Where are they going to get the cash from? But before we get into all of that, I'd like to say thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks recently, thank you so much for the time and effort you've taken to do that. I really appreciate it. I don't have time to respond individually to every single one. I wish I did, but I'd like to say thank you. Really, really appreciate it. And if you're a long-term supporter of the channel, either through Patreon or YouTube membership or Buy Me a Coffee membership, thank you for that long-term support. It really keeps me going, keeps me motivated, and keeps me thinking up new ideas for videos. So thank you. As I mentioned at the start of today's video, in 1994, the Chinese authorities introduced some new reforms that were designed to try to empower the local authorities to generate more earnings in their local regions, which was designed to generate more tax and therefore more income for the Chinese state. The central focus of these reforms was a concept of fiscal reorganisation, whereby the local authorities would be empowered to run their own budgets, and in exchange for that, the tax that they were paying to the central authorities was reduced from around 78% to around 50%. Now, as part of these reforms, the local authorities were told that they were not allowed to raise any debt in their own right. However, they were permitted to set up separate companies called local government financing vehicles that could raise debt in the form of bonds, and that debt could then be used to grow the local infrastructure. Now, interestingly, as part of these reforms, the central authorities said that the local governments were not allowed to pay for any of the interest or the repayments of those bonds using any taxes that were generated in the local area. The only way that they could actually fund the debt was through land sales. Now, all land in China is officially owned by the state, so you can't actually buy it, but you can lease it. And the local authorities were empowered to sell leases. And those leases were 70 years for residential uses, 50 years for industrial uses, and 40 years for commercial uses. And the selling of those leases was how these local authorities were going to fund themselves and grow their local infrastructure. And this chart is a simplified summary of how the system operates. The local government financing vehicle is the company that issues bonds. So they sell their bonds into the securities markets in exchange for cash. The local government financing vehicle then uses that cash to develop the infrastructure in the local environment. So they're building roads and electricity grids and other things that you need to build cities. And that investment in infrastructure makes that land more valuable to developers. And therefore, when the local authority sells the leases to that land, they can raise more money. And that money is then used to service the bonds and also to develop further infrastructure. So we've got a nice circular pattern here. As the local authority sells more leases, it has more cash. Therefore, it can afford to raise more debt because it can service more debt. But also, it can use the surplus cash to develop more infrastructure, which by definition increases the value of the land. It makes it more attractive. And so everyone's a winner. So as we've just discussed, from 1994 onwards, the expansion of urbanization in China, so the development of bigger and bigger cities all across China, was funded by local governments raising debt through local government financing vehicles. And this system worked fantastically well as long as the value of the land sales kept increasing, because that meant that those local governments had a larger and larger pot to use to be able to develop more infrastructure and to keep servicing that debt. The only thing that could go wrong with this system is if something happened to land sales, if they started to fall in value. This chart shows the total annual income from the sale of land rights by local governments in China between 2016 and 2023. And the scale on the left-hand side of this chart is shown in trillions of yuan. And just as a benchmark, $1 is trading currently for around 7.2 Chinese yuan. And what this chart shows is that between 2016 and 2020, there was a continuing and rapid increase in the income that local authorities were earning from land sales. In 2016, a total of 3.8 trillion yuan, or around 530 billion US dollars, was earned by local authorities. However, by 2020, that figure had increased to 8.4 trillion yuan, which is over $1.1 trillion. Now, in 2021, the growth did slow down. However, the local authorities still earned 8.7 trillion yuan. But as you can see, in 2022 and 2023, things started to go horribly wrong from the local authorities' point of view. In 2022, total income fell to 6.7 trillion yuan, which was a fall of over 2 trillion. And in 2023, total income fell by another 1.1 trillion yuan to 5.5 trillion. So as a direct result of the crisis that's hit the property market in China over the last couple of years, the income that the local authorities are receiving from the sale of land has dropped significantly. And this really isn't surprising, because if you think about the dynamics, the companies that were driving up those land sales were the huge property development businesses that had grown up in China over the last 30 years. And those companies had access to an almost unlimited amount of debt in the heyday of the property market. However, when the Chinese authorities introduced the 3 red lines, which restricted the amount of debt that property developers could take on, many of the big developers went into default. Evergrande was the most famous, and that's actually illiquid. It's going through a liquidation process right now. So what we've got is the buyers of all of that land have been taken out of the market because they no longer have any spare cash. In fact, a lot of them are struggling to be able to build the apartments that they've pre-sold to Chinese nationals. So there aren't any major buyers anymore, and as a result of that, the local authorities can't sell their land. The value of the land is falling and demand is also going down. And this is obviously a major problem because they've built up huge amounts of debt and they have a lot of obligations in terms of both the interest to pay on that debt and also the maturity of the debt. This chart shows the total value of all local government financing vehicle bonds that were maturing in each year between 2014 and 2024. And what this shows is that over the last 10 years, there has been a consistent and rapid increase in the number and value of bonds that are maturing. And the scale on the right-hand side of this chart is shown in trillions of Chinese yuan and goes from 0 at the bottom to 6 at the top. Back in 2014, the total value of all bonds that were maturing in that year was 303 billion Chinese yuan. However, if we fast forward to today, in 2024, the total value of all bonds that are maturing is 4.7 trillion yuan, which represents an increase of more than 15 times over the last 10 years. And if we look at what's happened over the last 3 years, in 2021, the total value of all bonds maturing was 3.5 trillion, compared with 4.7 trillion today, which represents an increase of around 35%. And if we just remind ourselves as to what's happened to income over that same period, there has been a dramatic fall of around 36%. And this chart compares the income that 20 local governments in China are earning from the projects that they've invested into against the interest payments that they're having to make on those bonds. The income is shown by the black bars on this chart, and the interest is shown by the blue bars. And what this chart is showing is that in every single one of these 20 regions, the income that they're earning from the projects is significantly less than the interest that they're having to pay on the bonds. So obviously from a cash flow point of view, that is an absolute disaster, because as I mentioned at the start of the video, the local authorities are not allowed to use tax or any other sort of income that they have that they're generating for the state to fund all of this debt. The cash flow has to be generated from the projects themselves, and these projects are not washing their face. They're not generating enough even to pay the interest, never mind the maturity of the bonds themselves. And this map of China shows the growing risk that China is facing as a result of the increase in debt in the local authorities. And what we've got here is a colour chart which shows the debt to income ratio for these regions, with the blue sections being less than 80% and the red section being more than 200%. And as you can see, we've got a lot of blue, a lot of light red, and some dark red all across China. So what this is telling us is that the debt to income ratio for the majority of these local authorities is now above 100%. And when you can't use any of your income to actually service the debt, this is causing major problems because they're already heavily indebted. But the fact that they can only use a small amount of their income to service the debt is potentially making the situation much, much worse, because it's ring-fenced the cash flow to make sure that the local authorities don't use other cash flow to pay that debt off. But the problem with that is they haven't got the cash to be able to service the debt, and so there is a real chance that the local authorities won't actually be able to afford to keep paying the debt. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think what's happening with the local government financing vehicle debt in China is actually a massive issue that isn't getting a lot of press coverage. When you're talking about $9 trillion of debt, normally you're talking about that being for a country. That is an enormous amount of debt for anybody to build up. But when you're talking about the fact that this is local governments in China, so it's not the Chinese state, they're not taking responsibility for this. They have farmed this out to all of the local governments. And those local governments are operating under very strict rules. They're not allowed to use the income that they're taking in terms of taxes and other forms of revenue to actually service that debt. The only way that they can pay for this debt is through the infrastructure that they've built using the money that they've raised. So this is meant to be self-funding. That's the way the Chinese authorities want it to operate. They don't want the Chinese local authorities dipping into their cash reserves to pay all of the debt providers. So that's all good and well from a big picture perspective. But when we're talking about $9 trillion of debt, somebody is going to have to pick up the bill for that, because on the other side of it, you've got $9 trillion worth of bondholders, people who've actually handed over cash, and they want to get serviced on that cash, so they want to be paid their interest, but also they would like to get repaid. And we looked at the maturity profile of the debt, and it's increasing year on year, and we're now getting to really large amounts. Now, as you may be aware, when we're talking about bonds, the normal course is that when you want to repay a bond, you issue a new bond. So basically the new money repays the old money, and the new bondholders then sit and get paid their interest. And that works well if you've got a company or a business that's doing well, if it's growing. But when you've got a company or a business that isn't doing very well, it becomes very difficult to issue that new bond. And what we're talking about in this situation are bonds relating to the property market in China. And if you've watched any of my videos over the last 2 or 3 years, you'll know that the property market in China is in a very sticky situation right now, as a result of the fact that the Chinese authorities decided to put the brakes on. They decided that too many companies had got themselves into an over-leveraged position. They'd taken on too much debt, and therefore they needed to be reined in. The Chinese authorities introduced what was called the 3 red lines, which restricted the amount of debt that those companies could access going forward. And as a result of that, many of them have become illiquid and potentially bankrupt. And what that's meant is that the property market in China has nosedived. And alongside that nosedive, we've also seen a drop in confidence, because the Chinese consumers for the last 30 years thought that property was the golden child. They wanted to put their money into it because it only went in one direction, up and up and up. However, when the 3 red lines was brought in and the companies that were building all of these apartments ran out of cash, they couldn't actually complete on a lot of pre-sales, things that they'd actually taken the money for in advance. So they couldn't even build those apartments. And for the first time ever, we saw the price of property actually falling in China. And as a result of that, the bubble was burst and everybody realised that the price can actually go in the opposite direction. And what's now happening is Chinese consumers are very cautious. Nobody really wants to buy property at the moment. So when you think about this $9 trillion worth of bond finance that's out there that needs to be refinanced, if you're a bondholder, the last thing that you'd want to put your money into right now is the Chinese property market. You'd have to be insane to start putting $9 trillion into that market. But essentially, that's what's going to have to happen, because every time one of those bonds matures, you need to issue a new bond to repay it. So you need to find some new debt providers to give you the cash to roll it over. Now, realistically, that's not going to happen. We're not going to have a whole lot of new investors coming along and saying, I'd really like to invest into the Chinese property market, please sign me up. Realistically, what we're talking about is a restructuring of the existing $9 trillion of debt. So basically, the existing bondholders don't really have much choice. If they say, I want to be repaid, they're not going to get that cash, and therefore they could try to do something to try to get their money back. But the local government financing vehicles are SPVs, special purpose vehicles. They've been set up separate to the local governments. So you can't actually sue the local government. You can't make that local authority bankrupt because China hasn't allowed that. You could go after the local government financing vehicle, but essentially that's a man of straw. It doesn't have any substance. All it owns is the projects that it's been investing into, and it doesn't actually own them because all land in China is owned by the state, so everything's provided on a lease. And I'm sure there's some terms and conditions in there somewhere that said if you're a bondholder and you tried to enforce, then that would invalidate all of those leases. So essentially, the bondholders don't really have a lot of options in terms of getting their money back. The only realistic option is to roll over into a new bond, to say, okay, I'll use the new bond to repay the old bond, and now you owe me the same amount of money for another 10 years, and you have to keep paying me some interest on it. So realistically, all the people who are in are going to be locked in forever. Now, most of the bondholders are within China. So we're talking about Chinese institutions, which ultimately will be owned by the Chinese state. So this is quite a circular situation. Essentially what we've got is a lot of debt that's been built up that's owed by the local authorities, but actually it's been provided by institutions that are being funded and owned by the Chinese state. So although the Chinese authorities have banned the local governments from actually borrowing money from them directly, in an indirect way, they've got the same money through different sources. So the overall summary of today's video is that the $9 trillion of debt that's been built up by the local authorities was taken on the assumption that land value in China would continue rising forever. As long as it kept going up in value and they made more and more sales, everyone was happy. However, as we've seen over the last 2 years, that's gone into reverse. So land values have fallen, demand for land has also gone down, and the local authorities are now left with nowhere to turn to. They don't have any option of making all those land sales, so they can't keep growing. In fact, they don't even have enough cash to be able to service the existing debt. So this is now zombie debt. If it was held by commercial entities, if this debt was being held by Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan and all of those sort of guys, then they would potentially try to enforce in the same way as happened with Evergrande. However, as we've talked about with Evergrande, basically you won't get any value back on that. These bonds are dead in the water. You are not going to get repaid because fundamentally the assets that these bonds have been built against are worth significantly less than the value of the bonds. So we've got a black hole here in terms of all of this financing. And at some point, this bubble could burst, which will cause major problems for China because we could see a domino effect here. As these bonds start to collapse and nobody's getting repaid, there will be black holes in the financing system in China, and that could lead to serious problems and a major recession in China. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.